In the cold winter of 1741, the city of New York sat on the edge of a knife. They did not know fear would soon turn their lives into a nightmare. A series of fires would burn the city. A dark plot would be discovered, or so they thought. This is the story of the New York conspiracy of 1741. It is a story of fire, fear, and a hunt for enemies that may not have existed. New York City in 1741 was very different from the city we know today. There was a big split between the rich and the poor. The rich merchants lived in big houses. The poor people struggled every day to find food and shelter. But there was another group of people. They were the enslaved. New York had a very large number of enslaved people. In fact, 1 out of every 5 people in the city was a slave. This was a high number for a northern colony. The enslaved people worked in the homes. They worked on the docks. They built the roads. They did the hard work that made the city run. They lived with no freedom. They lived with the constant threat of punishment. The fear in the city did not come from nowhere. The British Empire was at war with Spain. This was called the War of Jenkins' Ear. It was a strange name for a war, but the fighting was real. People in New York worried about Spanish spies. They worried about attacks from the sea. There was also fear of a slave rebellion. There had been a slave rebellion in New York in 1712. That violence was still in the memory of the white people. They were afraid it would happen again. The laws were very strict. Slaves could not meet in large groups. They could not walk the streets at night without a pass. The city was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The spark came in the middle of March. The weather was still cold. The wind blew hard off the water. On March 18, 1741, the governor's house caught fire. This was a big deal. The house was called Fort George. It stood at the tip of the island. It was the symbol of British power. The fire started in the chimney. It spread fast. The soldiers tried to put it out, but the wind was too strong. The building burned to the ground. The governor, George Clark, and his family had to run for safety. They watched their home burn. The people of the city watched too. They saw the smoke rise high into the sky. They felt safe knowing the governor was there. Now his house was gone. They wondered if it was an accident, or if someone did it on purpose. A week went by. The city tried to calm down. Then another fire broke out. This time it was a store near the river. Then a house burned down. Then a warehouse. The fires kept happening. They happened at night. They happened in different parts of the city. The people were scared. They did not sleep well. They looked out their windows watching for flames. They thought they saw faces in the dark. They thought they heard footsteps. The fear grew with every fire. The common talk was that this was not just bad luck, it was a plan. Someone was trying to burn the city. The authorities had to find the culprits. They needed answers. They looked for a scapegoat. They looked at the enslaved people. They looked at the poor whites who mixed with them. This brings us to a tavern. It was a drinking house run by a man named John Hewson. John Hewson was a poor man. He was not a good man. He was known as a thief. He sold stolen goods. He ran an illegal business. His tavern was on the west side of the city, near the Hudson River. It was a rough place. Sailors went there. Slaves went there. They went there to drink rum. They went there to dance. They went there to talk. John Hewson lived in the tavern with his wife, Sarah, and his daughter, Mary. They had a lodger. Her name was Mary Burton. Mary Burton was a young woman. She was an indentured servant. This meant she had to work for the Hewsons for a set number of years to pay off her debt. She was treated poorly. She was overworked. She was unhappy. She saw everything that happened in that tavern. She saw who came in. She heard what they said. She would become the most important witness in the whole event. The tavern was a special place for the enslaved people of the city. It was one of the few places they could go. There was a man named Caesar. He was a slave owned by a man named John Vark. Caesar was tall and strong. He was known as a leader among the slaves. He often went to Hewson's tavern. He brought other slaves with him. One of them was Prince. Prince was owned by a prominent family. Another was Cuffy. They would meet in the back room. They would drink and play games. The white owners of New York hated these gatherings. They thought the slaves were planning trouble. The authorities began to investigate the fires. They offered a reward. They offered money to anyone who had information about the fires. They also offered a reward to anyone who had information about stolen goods. This second offer is what caught the attention of a man named Robert Hogg. Mr. Hogg was a store owner. He had been robbed. He suspected John Hewson. He thought Hewson had his goods. He went to the authorities. He told them his story. The sheriff went to Hewson's tavern. He searched the place. He found the stolen goods from Mr. Hogg. He arrested John Hewson. He arrested his wife, Sarah. He arrested his daughter, Mary. He also arrested Mary Burton, the indentured servant. They were put in jail. The authorities needed to prove the theft. They needed to know who else was involved. They started to question Mary Burton. At first, Mary Burton said nothing. She was scared, but the pressure was high. The judges threatened her. They told her she could be executed for the theft if she did not tell the truth. They promised her freedom if she talked. They promised her a reward. The pressure worked. Mary Burton started to talk. But she did not just talk about theft. She talked about something much bigger. She talked about a conspiracy. She told the judges that the fires were not accidents. She said there was a plot to burn the city. This was the turning point. The theft case turned into a treason case. Mary Burton said that John Hewson was the leader of a plot. She said the slaves were planning to take over the city. She said they were going to kill all the white men. She said they were going to take the white women for themselves. She said they were going to set a new king on the throne, and she named names. She named Caesar. She named Prince. She named Cuffy. She said they met in the tavern to plan the attacks. She said Hewson gave them guns and swords. The judges listened. They wanted to believe her. It explained the fires. It explained their fears. There was a judge named Daniel Horsmanden. He was the recorder of the city. He was a smart man, but he was also a man of his time. He was very afraid of a slave uprising. He took Mary Burton's story very seriously. He wrote down every word she said. He used her testimony to build a case. He began to arrest the people she named. This started a wave of arrests. The city jail filled up. They arrested Caesar. They arrested Prince. They arrested Cuffy. They arrested many other slaves. They arrested poor whites, too. The trials began. The court did not act like courts today. There were no lawyers for the accused. The evidence was mostly hearsay. The main evidence was the word of Mary Burton and other witnesses who came forward later. One of these witnesses was a slave named Mary. She was known as Mary the Negress. She had been in the tavern. She saw the meetings. She added more details to the story. She made the plot seem even bigger. She said there was a list of names, a secret list of people who were part of the plot. She said they were going to poison the water supply. This terrified the city. The people believed that there were hundreds of conspirators. They thought enemies were all around them. The stories became wild. This is where the conspiracy theories grew. The white people of New York let their imaginations run wild. They believed there was a massive army hiding in the shadows. They believed the Spanish were involved. They said the Spanish Catholics were behind it. They thought Spain wanted to destroy the city because of the war. They said the Spanish priests were coming to convert the slaves and turn them against their masters. This fear of the Spanish and Catholics was very old in Europe. It was called the Popish plot fear. It had come to America. People thought the Pope was trying to take over the world. In New York, they mixed this fear with their fear of slaves. They created a monster in their minds. They thought there was a secret army of Catholic slaves and Spanish soldiers ready to attack. They called them the Spanish Negroes. This was one of the wildest theories. There was no proof of a Spanish army, but the fear was real. Another wild theory was about the structure of the plot. Mary Burton said there was a hierarchy. She said the slaves had their own government. She said they were going to elect a governor. She said they were going to appoint kings and princes to rule over different parts of the city. This showed how little the white people understood the slaves. They thought the slaves wanted to copy the British government. They thought the slaves wanted a king. This idea made the threat seem very organized and very dangerous. The atmosphere in the city was tense. People did not trust their neighbors. A slave who looked at a white person the wrong way could be arrested. A white person who was nice to a slave could be suspected of being part of the plot. The trials moved fast. The court used a procedure called turning state's evidence. If an accused person confessed and named others, they might be spared. If they denied the charges, they were often found guilty and executed. This created a cycle of accusations. One person would name 10 people to save their own life. Then those 10 people would be arrested. To save themselves, they would name 10 more. The circle grew wider and wider. The evidence became weaker and weaker, but the judges did not stop. They believed they were saving the city. Judge Horsmonden believed he was doing God's work. He thought he was stopping a devilish plot. The first group of men went to trial. Caesar, Prince, and Cuffy were the first to face the court. The courtroom was packed. People wanted to see justice done. The witnesses stood up. Mary Burton pointed her finger at the men. She swore they were guilty. Mary the Negress did the same. The men defended themselves. They said they were innocent. They said they were not at the tavern. They said they did not start any fires. But their words did not matter. The jury believed the witnesses. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death. The city wanted to make an example of them. The executions were public. They were meant to scare anyone else who might think of rebelling. The method of execution was brutal. Caesar was burned at the stake. It was a slow and painful death. Prince and Cuffy were hanged. Their bodies were left to rot as a warning. The crowd watched in silence or in cheers. The fear was still there, mixed with a grim satisfaction that the enemies were being punished. But the fires did not stop. More buildings caught fire. The panic grew. The authorities thought the executions would solve the problem. They thought the remaining conspirators would be too scared to act. They were wrong. The fires continued. This made the court believe there were more people involved. They thought the network was deeper than they imagined. They arrested more people. They questioned them harder. They used torture to get confessions. The use of torture was a dark chapter in this story. It was illegal in British law to torture citizens, but the authorities found a way around it. They used a method called pen, fort, and dure. This meant pressing heavy stones on a prisoner's chest until they talked or died. They also threatened to send slaves to the West Indies to work on the sugar plantations. This was a fate worse than death. The heat and the work in the West Indies killed men quickly. The threat of being shipped away was enough to make many people confess to anything. The stories that came out during these torture sessions were unbelievable. People confessed to plans that sounded like fantasies. They said they were going to blow up the fort. They said they were going to set the whole island on fire. The conspiracy became larger than life. It was no longer just a few slaves and a tavern keeper. It was a vast network that reached every part of the city. The white people saw shadows everywhere. One of the most heartbreaking parts of this story was the case of the Uptown conspirators. These were slaves who lived and worked further up on the island. They were arrested because other slaves named them. They had nothing to do with John Hewson's tavern. They had never met Caesar or Prince. They were just living their lives. But the fear had consumed the city. Reason had left the building. Among those arrested was a man named John Ury. He was a white man. He was a schoolteacher. He was also a Catholic priest, or so the authorities claimed. This was a huge catch for the court. They had been looking for a Catholic mastermind. They believed Ury was the brain behind the whole operation. They thought he had converted the slaves and planned the uprising. This proved their theory about the Spanish and the Pope. Mary Burton said she saw him at the tavern. Other witnesses identified him. The evidence was flimsy, but the desire to find a Catholic leader was strong. John Ury was put on trial. He defended himself with intelligence. He pointed out the flaws in the witnesses' stories. He argued that there was no proof. But the jury did not care. He was a Catholic. He was a stranger. He was guilty. The city of New York had become a place of madness. Neighbor turned against neighbor, slave turned against master. The legal system was broken. It was no longer about finding the truth, it was about feeding the fear. The fires of fear had burned through the logic of the people. They only saw what they wanted to see. They saw a conspiracy that justified their own prejudices. The trial of John Ury marked the highest point of the city's fear. John Ury was not a poor man. He was a schoolteacher. He could read and write in several languages. He looked different from the other prisoners. He carried himself with dignity. The authorities believed he was the secret leader of the plot. They said he was a Catholic priest in disguise. To the Protestant people of New York, a Catholic priest was a dangerous enemy. They believed he had come to the city to turn the slaves against their masters and destroy the Protestant government. The courtroom was crowded when John Ury stood trial. Judge Horsmanden sat on the bench. He wanted to prove that there was a foreign hand in the fires. The witnesses brought forward were the same ones who had testified before. Mary Burton was there. She said she saw John Ury at Hewson's Tavern. She said he was writing letters for the slaves. Another witness, a man named William Kane, said he saw Ury performing Catholic rituals. This was a serious accusation. In that time, people believed Catholic priests took an oath to kill Protestants. John Ury defended himself. He was calm and smart. He asked questions that the witnesses could not answer. He proved that he was not at the tavern on the nights Mary Burton mentioned. He showed that he was a schoolteacher, not a priest. He argued that the witnesses were lying to save themselves. He pointed to the lack of physical evidence. No one found guns or secret letters in his home. His defense was strong. He made sense. But the jury was not listening to logic. They were listening to their fear. They wanted someone to blame for the terror of the past months. They found John Ury guilty. He was sentenced to death. The executions had already begun before Ury's trial. They were brutal public events. The city wanted to send a message. The message was clear. Rebellion would be met with death. The gallows were built on a little island called the Freshwater Pond. Today, this area is near the criminal courthouse in Manhattan, but in 1741, it was a desolate place. The bodies of the hanged men dangled in the wind for days. The method of execution depended on who you were. The slaves were treated with the most cruelty. Caesar, whom we met earlier, was one of the first to die. He was not hanged, he was burned at the stake. The crowd gathered to watch. They tied him to a post. They piled wood around his feet. The fire was lit. It was a slow and painful death. Before he died, he was asked to confess. He was asked to name others. He refused. He said he was innocent to the very end. Other slaves faced the same fate. Quack was burned. Cuffy was hanged, and then his body was burned. The city officials believed that burning the bodies would prevent the spirit of rebellion from spreading. It was a gruesome spectacle. People brought their children to watch. They wanted them to see what happened to those who threatened the peace. The smell of burning flesh filled the air. It was a smell the city would not forget for a long time. John Hewson, the tavern keeper, also faced death. He was white. He was not a slave, but the court treated him as a traitor. He was found guilty of treason. This was a rare charge. It meant he had betrayed his own people. He was hanged alongside the slaves. His wife, Sarah, was also found guilty. She was sentenced to death as well. But her story was different. She claimed she was pregnant. The law said a pregnant woman could not be executed. She waited in jail for her time. She eventually died there years later, still waiting for her fate.
The number of people executed was high. History tells us that over 30 people were put to death. Some were hanged, some were burned, some died in jail before they could be executed. But the number of people banished was even higher. More than 70 people were sent away. The court called this transportation. They were sent to the West Indies. They were put on ships and sold to work on the sugar plantations. This was a sentence worse than death for many. The work in the sugar fields was incredibly hard. The heat was unbearable. Most people sent there did not live more than a year. Families were torn apart. Husbands were sent to one island, wives to another. They never saw each other again. The trials went on for months. The city was in a state of frenzy. No one felt safe. A rumor could destroy a life. If a neighbor did not like you, they could say they saw you at a meeting. They could say you signed a secret list. The court would believe them. The burden of proof was on the accused. But how could you prove you were not at a secret meeting in the dark? You could not. The legal system was broken. It had stopped looking for justice. It was only looking for order. Mary Burton stayed at the center of it all. She continued to name names. She received rewards for her testimony. The city promised her money. They promised her freedom from her indentured service. She became a tool of the court. But her life was not easy. She lived with the guilt and the fear. She was an outcast. She was hated by the families of the people she accused. She could never truly be free of the events of 1741. Slowly, the fires stopped. The winter turned to spring, and spring turned to summer. The rains came. The dry wood that fed the fires became wet. The panic began to fade. The trials slowed down. The court ran out of witnesses. They ran out of people to blame. The city was exhausted. The authorities claimed victory. They said they had crushed the conspiracy. They said they had saved the city. They printed reports and books about the trial. Judge Horsmanden wrote a detailed account of the events. In his book, he said the conspiracy was real. He said it was a miracle the city survived. But looking back with clear eyes, we see a different picture. Historians have studied the trial records for years. They look for the truth. They look for the evidence. They have found very little. There is no proof of a grand army of slaves. There is no proof of a Spanish invasion. There were no guns found. No lists of names were ever discovered. The only evidence came from the mouths of terrified people trying to save their own lives. The wildest theories seem to have been just that, theories. The idea that the slaves planned to elect a king and take over the city seems unlikely. Most slaves in New York were from different parts of Africa. They spoke different languages, they had different cultures. It would have been very hard for them to organize such a complex plot without being detected. The fear of a popish plot was a ghost from the past that had come to haunt New York. The white people projected their own fears onto the enslaved population. They saw a rebellion because they were terrified of losing control.
There were small crimes, certainly. John Hewson was a thief. He likely sold stolen goods. There might have been slaves who talked about freedom. It is natural for people to dream of being free. There might have been a few small fires set by accident or by individuals acting alone. But there was no master plan. There was no giant army. The Great Negro Plot was mostly a product of fear. It was a mass hysteria that consumed the city. The consequences of this hysteria lasted a long time. The laws in New York changed. The slave codes became much stricter. The government was afraid. They wanted to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. They passed a law that said no more than 4 slaves could meet at one time. This made it hard for families to gather. They passed a law that said slaves could not be out at night without a candle and a lantern. They passed a law that prohibited slaves from owning horses or cattle. They tightened the grip on the enslaved population even more. The fear also changed the way the city treated poor white people. The poor whites and the slaves had lived close together before 1741. They worked together. They drank together. After the trials, the white leaders wanted to separate them. They did not want poor whites and slaves becoming friends. They thought that friendship led to conspiracy. They created new laws to punish white people who stayed with slaves. The divide between the races grew wider. The city became more segregated. The story of 1741 New York conspiracy is a sad story. It is a story about power and fear. It shows what happens when people are scared and are looking for someone to blame. It shows how the legal system can fail when it is driven by panic instead of facts. The fires of fear burned bright that year. They destroyed lives. They destroyed families. They left scars on the city that took a long time to heal. We must remember the people who died. We must remember the slaves who were burned and hanged for a crime they likely did not commit. We must remember the poor whites who were caught in the middle. We must remember John Urey, who was killed because of prejudice. Their voices were silenced in 1741. The court records tell us their names, but they do not tell us their stories. We can only imagine the terror they felt. We can only imagine the pain of being accused, tried, and executed in a city gone mad. In the end, the city survived. New York grew. It became a great city. But the memory of 1741 stayed. It became a warning. It taught future generations about the dangers of hysteria. It reminds us today that justice requires facts, not just fear. The fires of fear are a dark chapter in the history of American freedom. They show us that freedom is fragile. It can be destroyed by the very people who are supposed to protect it.